My name's Chris Britton. I'm the Dean of Divinity here at Trinity College, and that's the Orthodox School of Theology here at Trinity. Works within the Faculty of Divinity, and so I'm delighted both to have you all here, and I'm delighted to honor our guest of distinction today, not our guest, but our person of distinction today, Paul Ladouceur. So I'm sure he's known to all of you here, but just a few things we should all note about Dr. Ladouceur. You'll know he's an Orthodox theologian, that he lives in Quebec, but he resides here in Toronto for part of the year as he teaches theology and spirituality in the Orthodox School of Theology in the Faculty of Divinity here at Trinity. He also teaches at the Université Laval in Montreal. You'll know that he's written a number of books on Orthodox theology, including a general introduction, Living Orthodoxy, which is also available in French, Raconte avec l'Orthodoxie, book on Saint Maria of Paris, also in French, and he's edited a book of writings of Father Lev Gillet, a monk of the Eastern Church, published in France, and a book of translations of writings of Saint Maria of Paris, published in France in 2011. He also is responsible for quite a bit of blog activity and online work, including responsible for the French language website, Page Orthodoxe, La Transfiguration, and an electronic bulletin, Lumière du Tabor. Although you might also note that he's often published on public orthodoxy at Fordham University, where sometimes he writes things that gets a fair bit of polemic back and forth, including one defense of deaconesses in the Orthodox tradition that seemed, at least to my outsider reading, got a fairly polemical reply, which was probably, I'm sure you might agree, quite unsatisfying in its depth and engagement with the argument that Dr. Ladouceur was making, but quite very engaged online, chiefly with issues of public theology, so very much engaging with modern issues, contemporary issues in our society from an Orthodox perspective, which I trust you all value a great deal. He's a member of the Faith and Witness Commission of the Canadian Council of Churches, and he teaches in areas of Christian spirituality, especially spirituality of the Eastern Church, Orthodox spirituality in the 20th century, modern Orthodox theology, Orthodox dogmatic theology, Christianity in Russia, and the history and theology of Ecumenism. Here at Trinity College, the courses he's currently teaching are modern Orthodox theology, the 15th century to the 21st, and recently the Orthodox Church, Christianity, and other faith traditions. So a very valuable member of this community, and so I'm very pleased that we can celebrate with him the publication of two recent books, Modern Orthodox Theology, an impressive looking volume, just even if you look at the size before you look at the table of contents, and also the patristic witness of George Thorovsky, thank you, and Essential Theological Writings, which is well worth a look as well. So would you please join with me in congratulating Dr. Ladouceur.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd like to say a few words before opening up for questions and discussion. Just to give a general idea, sort of fitting things in where Chris mentioned. This book actually had its origins in courses on modern Orthodox theology that I have been teaching both here at Trinity College and also in Montreal. And after teaching the course a few times, I realized that it would be useful to have a more in-depth treatment going into various aspects of the subject more than is possible in a course, with the view of producing a full-length monograph. So this is the book that we have here today. I'd like to express my appreciation to Trinity College, to its deans, Chris and Chris's predecessor, the students in my courses, and the library, of course, where we are today, for the opportunity to work on the manuscript of this book in conjunction with my teaching here. I especially want to thank Dr. David Nealons, former Dean of the Faculty of Divinity, for providing research support for the work. And also Maria Simakova, still a doctorate student here at the University of Toronto, who acted as a research assistant during a critical phase of the writing of the book. A little quotation from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar: "I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." This will set the tone for the remainder of my remarks, because what I want to offer is, rather than surveying the main themes of the book, is to offer some critiques of the book. As if I were reviewing the book myself. So what would I critique in my book? But of course, I take the opportunity of presenting the defense as well as the critiques. So I have 7 critiques, just to make sure that I stay humble in this process. The first has to do with the title of the book. The title is rather ambitious, presumptive, and even arrogant. But despite this, its coverage is incomplete. There are many areas of modern Orthodox theology that it does not cover. For example, in certain countries of Orthodox tradition, such as Serbia, Bulgaria, Georgia, the Christian Middle East, these are not covered in the book. So in my defense, first of all, it's already a big book, and in fact it's too big. But by and large, the theology in these countries that I've mentioned, in my humble opinion, has not been particularly productive or original, with a few notable exceptions, and the notable exception particularly is Serbia. St. Nicholas Velimirovic and St. Justin Popovic certainly warrant more attention than I've been able to give them in this book. And of course, there's no chapter on Orthodox theology in North America, meaning mostly the United States, or Western Europe. Well, in fact, most of the chapter on neo-patristic theology concerns theologians based in Western Europe and the United States, as does the portion of the chapter on the Russian religious Renaissance, covering the period after the triumph of the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. And similarly, a lot of the material concerning the issues studied in part 2 of the book, which is focused on specific problem areas, specific issues, arises from writings of Orthodox theologians of the West. Conceptually, I found it very difficult to justify chapters on Western Europe and North America, a problem which is not as marked for Greece and Romania, for which there are in fact specific chapters. The geographic demarcation of Orthodox theology in Western Europe and North America may have made some sense prior to World War II, but much less so in post-war decades, and certainly now in an age of instantaneous communication. Orthodox theology is now truly global. So the approach that I take in the book is more focused in the first part on general approaches to theology in a historical context, and in the second part on specific theological issues which cut across geographical boundaries. Second critique, getting a little bit more serious here. Much of the book is predicated on the existence of 3 principal approaches or types of theology: academic or school theology, religious philosophy, or the Russian religious Renaissance, and neo-patristic theology. These categories, the critic would say, are simply too rigid to account for all of the diversity in modern Orthodox thought. And the placing of particular personalities in one or the other of these categories is highly artificial. Yes, the book is guilty of this fault, but I have an explanation for it. These 3 basic approaches to theology, in effect, form the warp, if you like, around which the woof of the teachings of the individual theologians has been woven. I could not think of a better way of putting some order, both chronologically and conceptually, highlighting a dynamism and interrelationships into what could otherwise be an enormous, undifferentiated mass of writings. I studiously avoid the use of the term school to refer to any of these approaches. School suggests a degree of uniformity, which the three streams simply do not have. And finally, I stress more in the book the links among the theological notions in the dominant modes of theology than the breaks. This is picking up the terms from the title of the conclusion of George Florovsky's The Ways of Russian Theology. These conclusions called breaks and links. In particular, the book emphasizes continuity in several specific areas, notably between religious philosophy and neo-patristic theology, and especially in areas such as ecclesiology and the theology of the human person. Third critique. The book, the analysis, relies upon and emphasizes too much a relatively limited number of secondary sources. Yes, certain secondary sources are frequently cited throughout the book. Partly this is to give my own analysis a greater authority, relying on higher figures than I'm able to muster, and partly to show where prominent Orthodox thinkers either agree or disagree with each other on particular issues. The most cited authors are not just latter-day ivory tower academics, but as I write, they were leading Orthodox personalities in the very movements in which they actively participated. The relevant works by George Florovsky, Nicholas Berdyaev, Basil Zenkovsky, Nicholas Lavsky, Nicholas Zernov, Paul Dokimov, and Christos Yanaras are, quote, more than academic studies. They are personal statements by important and astute thinkers and observers in the development of modern Orthodox theology, and are thereby valuable signposts and testimonials by key participants in the very subject of the book. The fourth point of critique. The book is heavily slanted to Russian theologians and does not give enough attention to Greek theologians. This is the perpetual divide in orthodoxy between the Greek world and the Russian world. Well, this is true. But much of Greek theology in modern times was deeply enmeshed in the rather dry and repetitive neo-scholastic academic theology well into the second half of the 20th century. And frankly, there is little of interest to say about Greek academic theology that has not been said at great length, perhaps too great length, by George Maloney in his 1976 book, A History of Orthodox Theology since 1453, the fall of Constantinople. Or what has been said much more concisely and more incisively by Metropolitan Kallistos Ware in his masterly and very diplomatic 4-page review of that last great monument of Greek academic theology, the Dogmatica of Tremolas Panayotis. The chapter on Greece, in fact, covers both the theology of the Greek religious movements and the emergence of neo-patristic theology in Greece with the theology of the 1960s. What is not adequately covered on the Greek front is the enormous scholarly output of Greek theologians in recent times. With respect to the Greek theology of the last quarter century or so, the final section of the chapter on Greece focuses, quote, mainly on those aspects of Greek theological scene of the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, which have achieved a certain measure of international visibility, with an emphasis on younger theologians, at the risk of skewing the fullness of modern Greek theology considered from an internal perspective. There are more theologians in Greece per square kilometer than anywhere else in the world. But only a small fraction of their writings is accessible in translation. And only a few of the books, even of such a well-known figure as Christos Yanaras, have been translated. Yanaras has published over 75 books, less than a dozen of which have been translated. I'm not certain that even in Greece, few, if any, scholars have fully grasped the diversity and depth of his thinking. Theology in Greece certainly merits by itself a full-scale monograph. So one of the unwritten premises of modern Orthodox theology in my book is that much of what is creative and relevant in modern Orthodox thought owes its origin, either directly or indirectly, to the Russian theologians, both those of the religious Renaissance and the neo-patristic mode of theology. The fifth point, the selection of issues treated in part 2 of the book is highly arbitrary. There are lots of other issues and themes in modern Orthodox thought that should have been taken up. Very true. I have anticipated this critique in my foreword. We have nonetheless sought to include the most important theological questions in Orthodoxy over the past century and a half, especially those in which there have been, and in many cases continue to be, divergent and conflicting views. Many other questions could have been covered, such as the theology of icons, of the environment, questions of bioethics, but by and large there has been more cohesion of Orthodox thought and hence less overt conflict in these areas than those included in this book. If I were writing the book today, rather than 4 or 5 years ago, it would, for example, have been necessary to expand the issues covered in the chapter on personhood to include different conceptions within Orthodoxy on human sexuality and gender differentiation. Sixth point, some of the thematic chapters, especially 9, God and Creation, and 10, entitled Divine Humanity, Personhood, and Human Rights, bring together under one roof concepts which are at best only loosely related to each other, if they relate to each other at all. Well, this is only partly true. My objective in bringing it together in some chapters as seeming a smorgasbord of ideas is to show that, in fact, they do deal with broadly similar and even closely related nexus of problems. For example, in chapter 9, the basic issue is, how does God relate to creation? This is hardly a new problem, but modern Orthodox thinkers have produced a number of different, overlapping, and conflicting answers to the question. My aim has been to show that these answers all relate to the problem, to show the sources and relationships among the answers and the extent to which the various answers have or have not found echo in the wider Orthodox community and beyond. Similarly, chapter 10, the underlying problematic is, what does it mean to exist as a person? Modern Orthodox personalism, derived from fundamental notions in patristic theology of divine existence, is, as I say, quote, a golden thread running through modern Orthodox theology, from Kirevsky to Solovyev and Frank, from Florovsky and Bulgakov to Losky, Yanaras, Zizioulas, and Kallistos Ware. The section on human rights is a special case. In the first drafts of the book, the section was in the chapter on social and political theology. But on further reflection, I could see that modern notions of human rights flow from theological anthropology, especially what it means to have, as Yanaras puts it, a personal mode of existence, hence the presence of human rights in this chapter. The final point is that the book focuses so much on religious philosophy and neo-patristic theology that it does not do justice to traditional or so-called academic theology, which is rather summarily dismissed. Nor does the book deal with mystical or ascetic theology, except for some passing references. Well, mea culpa for academic theology. In the conclusion, I write, academic theology features as a poor second cousin of religious philosophy and theology and neo-patristic theology in the study. Yet academic theology was and remains a powerful force in orthodoxy, especially in theological education, notably in seminaries and theological schools in countries of Orthodox tradition, where manuals of theology in the old style are still popular. Orthodox academic theology continued to exercise a certain fascination in non-Orthodox circles long after it had become dépassé in mainstream Orthodox thought. So again, I would refer an interested reader to George Maloney's scholarly monograph, A History of Orthodox Theology since 1453. Frankly, it is a rather boring book. In a more detached fashion, this is what I write about it in the conclusion. Despite the book's ambitious title, it is mostly a scholarly study of Orthodox academic theology. The Russian religious Renaissance and neo-patristic theology hardly received more than passing nods, and are certainly not seen as significantly different approaches to theology than school theology. Maloney deals summarily with Russian theology in exile, but the religious Renaissance prior to the Revolution of 1917 merits less than a page. The vibrant Greek theology of the 60s is not signaled out. On the other front, now, ascetic theology, or spirituality, or even mystical theology is another matter. Yes, this features here and there in the book, but it's certainly not the major focus. Rather, the book follows an academic and not very orthodox distinction between theology and spirituality. It's not the title of Vladimir Solovyev's well-known classic study, The Mystical Theology of the Orthodox Church. Solovyev's perspective, which I wholeheartedly endorse, is that in the Orthodox tradition, it is not possible to separate theology from mysticism, thinking about God from the experience of God. I teach, as Chris mentioned, both modern Orthodox theology and modern Orthodox spirituality in separate courses. Academically, this makes sense, even if it constitutes an important infringement on the Orthodox mystical theological tradition. Now, to make up for this lacuna in this book, I'm currently writing a companion book, tentatively entitled Living in the Spirit, and perhaps with an unimaginative subtitle, Modern Orthodox Spirituality. Well, some will say that's a feeble excuse. Well, perhaps it is, but perhaps in a few years' time as well, we may have a book launch for the follow-up volume to make up for this omission in modern Orthodox theology. So if anyone still wants to read the book, I'm prepared to receive comments or questions.
We have a.
If I may, start by congratulating you. I mean, I am not familiar with the book, unfortunately. I think I did glimpse on the internet some of the commendations or endorsements, and they're very impressive. So, I mean, they speak for themselves. So, you know, I want to start with that expression of admiration, and then just a question, precisely because I don't know, I'm not familiar with the contents. I'm wondering whether you deal with Orthodox Christian exegetes, in other words, theologians engaged in biblical exegesis, and if not, what do you think that says about Florovsky's very famous adage? I mean, he wrote a whole piece on the lost scriptural mind, and the fact that, as we know, I mean, we're very distant from a patristic approach in that frequently the scriptures for Eastern Christians are, I mean, in some cases you have people who will actually know the scriptures inside out, but in terms of, critical reflection or, an appropriation that is filtered through some kind of study, it sometimes is not exactly the hallmark of Eastern Christianity. And yet, there are a fair number of exegetes out there. Oddly enough, probably 2/3 of them are just rather bad carbon copies of what you will find in a standard, well, for better or for worse, sorry. For better or for worse, they very much imitate approaches that you will find in Western theology. So I wasn't intending to do another presentation, but I'm very interested in your response. Very interested in your response to that question about exegetes and their place in theology.
Biblical scholarship has been one of the weaknesses of modern Orthodox theology. This was recognized by no less figure than Father Alexander Schmemann as early as about 50 years ago. He made this comment. There are several reasons for this, but one of them is a certain fear or reticence within Orthodoxy of modern biblical critical approaches, which seem to question the value, the importance, the inspiration, the sort of divine human nature of the Bible itself, and was seen as kind of a Protestant thing that Orthodox should stay away from. So I think this kind of attitude has had a powerful impact on the weakness of biblical scholarship within Orthodoxy. Now, it's not an issue that I specifically take up. I think I may mention this in passing somewhere. Sometimes I forget what's in parts of the book. But this would be my take on it. There are reasonably good Orthodox Eastern Christian biblical scholars, but far away from the sort of forefront, I would say, and very much a tendency to rely on the fathers in their interpretation of Scripture, because after all, most patristic writings are precisely exegesis of the Bible. So that would be sort of my take on it. It is and remains a weak area in Orthodox theological scholarship.
Yeah, I actually have read the book, and
You get a prize.
yeah, I mentioned to Dr. Ladouceur that having taken the course and then having read the book afterwards, it's really neat because the course is probably about maybe a quarter, maybe a third of the book, and then to read the book afterwards, besides reinforcing everything in the course, it gives layers and layers of depth to it. So my question would be, it's related to your fifth critique of the book.
Okay.
What isn't there? And there were four things that in reading it that I noticed that maybe could have been included. One was exactly as Father Peter said, the whole issue of biblical interpretation, because there's basically one page there at about 430 or so that talks about that. And I think that you could have put something in there because, you have the Pentateuch's book about the Old Testament where the interpretation is done in the context of liturgy and iconography and all those kinds of things. So the scriptural or biblical theology, iconography, because you speak about the icons very much in the issue of the onomatodoxy, the name worshiping thing there, but the name as an icon, so there was nothing there about iconography. Eschatology, because you refer to that in, I believe, fairly consistently in the in the chapter about ecclesiology, and that, and what was the fourth one? And I can't remember now. Anyway, but there were these four things that I thought you could have included something there.
Yes. Well, the defense I gave is that I wanted to focus on issues where there had been significant differences in approach and even direct conflict among leading Orthodox thinkers. So yes, the selection of issues is arbitrary, but that was the main criteria.
Yeah, the fourth one was liturgy.
Liturgy.
I was
Well,
thinking
there's a little bit there, but
Yeah.
again, my reaction would be that without having explored in much detail the eschatology part, these are not areas where there has been significant conflict differing, very radically differing points of view within Orthodoxy. There's much more unity of approach than in the other areas that I picked. So yes, there is scope for more work in these areas. But I said that was the criterion. It was the extent to which the issues had been come up over a relatively long period of time, particularly if the issues came out both in religious philosophy and in neo-patristic theology, to stress both the continuity and the discontinuity between these two major strands of thinking. So that was the criteria, and that is why issues such as these didn't make it to the short list.
And of course, on the when it comes to publishing a book, what doesn't make it in, there's always what a commissioning editor, how many pages she or he is willing to grant you.
I have a little story here. Okay. I was way over the limit that had been set by the publisher. So when I sent it in, I said, what's going to happen? Are they going to say, it's too long, cut it back? And my reaction is to be, I can't cut it back. Why don't you do 2 books? But they didn't question anything, sort of swallowed it all and said, okay, fine. And that's why you have such a big, 2 bricks. It's not 1, it's 2.
Good for T&T Clerk.
So Brian,
Dr. Butcher's other patient. Yeah.
I look forward to communication. Paul, thank you for sharing that with us. Just one comment and then a question. I'm intrigued to hear you say that in your estimation, and again, this is without having read it, you consider eschatology to be the area of general agreement to convergence. One only has to line up a Lazar Palo, soul sleepers, along with the toll housers on the other side, to realize that you ask questions about eschatology, purgatory, among 4 Orthodox, you get 5 opinions. So that seems to me, if you want another book to put into your into your lineup for future projects, perhaps you do want to give attention to that, at least the way modern theologians have attempted to make sense of the variegated sources that we have in our tradition, from what that appear in the hagiography or in the actual rites, post-mortem rites that we have and what have you. But the question was more, to what extent do Oriental Orthodox and or the Syrian Church of the East traditions figure in this? If so, where? If not, why not? Aside from the conventional answer of length already excluding it, I'm more interested in your on a matter of principle. To what extent does, in your estimation, does Orthodox theology need to take account of non-Byzantine traditions, Syriac, Latin, Coptic, what have you, in order to give fulsome answers to the questions that you're engaged in?
To deal with the first one, I do have a publication on that, which is specifically on the toll house controversy and other related Orthodox theologies of the afterlife.
A book or article?
It's actually an extended review article of about 7 different publications. Yeah, it's not in here, but it is elsewhere. On the other point, this is what you raise actually is one of the major critiques of neo-patristic theology, that it is too exclusively grounded on and focused on Greek Byzantine tradition, with a tendency to exclude other Christian traditions, including Latin, Russian, Oriental Orthodox. This arises in part from George Florovsky himself, his own predilections, and sort of partly from the lack of familiarity of Orthodox with other traditions. It's interesting with respect to Florovsky himself. One reads Florovsky a lot, which I've done in the last few years. He was once asked about this, and I think it's written somewhere around somewhere this little quotation. He said, "Well, Augustine really was a Greek father." But it really is quite astonishing the extent to which he quotes Augustine, which is in a way sort of upsetting his own apple cart, because he dismissed Russian theology completely and a lot of Latin Western theology, but he really likes Augustine. So my answer would be this critique of neo-patristic theology, which I do discuss in the book, is valid. Neo-patristic theology has had this tendency to consider other Christian traditions' expression of the content of the faith not to be as significant as the Greek Byzantine expression. And I think this is wrong. It's one of the main contemporary critiques of neo-patristic theology. There are others, but that's one of the important ones.
This it's not a critical question, so like I'm curious. I only had a chance to skim key portions of the book, but I'm curious who, like, from your vantage point, who do you see as the primary audience of the book? Because as I was skimming it, I thought, students and instructors in sites of theological education, but then I think it was in your 7th critique, you sort of, in your defense of the 7th critique, I believe you seem to signal that the standard approach to theological education might not see this book as in their realm of familiarity or their usual approach. So I guess I'm wondering, like, where do you think this book will be read, and then, like, where do you hope it will be read?
Well, this question kind of came up in my dealings with T&T Clark, the publisher, because after I had submitted the manuscript, in fact, I was told that they were going to put it into a textbook series. I said, oh, okay, why? When I finally got the page proofs, the first proofs back, I didn't particularly like the format. I had to argue a little bit to get a somewhat better format. But they, as a publisher, saw it as a textbook. Well, that has some legitimacy to it because it did arise from teaching a course and could be used in teaching courses, both in Orthodox and non-Orthodox context. And I think that from a publishing point of view, that's probably going to be a very significant audience, are non-Orthodox schools of theology, religion, who wish to have some kind of Orthodox component, whether it's taught by an Orthodox or not. Well, here's a sort of an overview that can be used as the basis for a course. My own ambition, in a sense, was greater than that, to present, as I indicated in some of my remarks, to try to sort of work against some of the standard conventions that we have concerning the relationship of particularly the two major streams of theology, where one often has the impression that when neo-patristic theology appeared on the scene, Russian religious thought kind of disappeared completely. Well, it's not quite true. It's far more complex than that, because some of the ideas developed in the Russian religious philosophy found their way into neo-patristic theology as mainstream all of a sudden, transformed, and I mentioned particularly personalism, but there are other aspects as well. So it stressed more the continuity there than is typically the case. And sort of, what are the references? Where are people coming from? And even somebody like Vladimir Lovsky drew a lot of what is in his mystical theology of the Eastern Church from his predecessors, who were the Russian religious thinkers. So there's a hope that sort of on a broader academic sense that some of what I think are incorrect interpretations of the history and development of modern Orthodox theology will be set right with this. The same with contemporary critiques of neo-patristic theology. Some of them are sound and some of them are completely off base. Again, that's the kind of thing that I hope will be corrected in a more specific case by some of the remarks and analysis that I have made.
Well, thank you. Let me first repeat the congratulations of others on your recent publications. I'm so ignorant of your specialization that I'm reluctant to ask any questions, but one
I
name...
recommend a good book.
Well, it's going to change. You did mention one name that sticks in my head as a failed saint, as a dramatist, and maybe even as a prophet. You mentioned Solovyev's name. And I was wondering, maybe just for my own edification, could you talk a little bit about where Solovyev fits? I'm sure it's a complicated fit, but where in such a work does he find a place?
Vladimir Solovyev, is probably the leading intellectual figure of the Russian religious Renaissance of the late 19th century, early 20th century. He was primarily a philosopher, but also a mystic, a poet, and his writings had a very powerful impact throughout what I refer to as the Christian intelligentsia in late imperial Russia. Some of his ideas pretty far out, particularly ideas of divine Sophia, divine wisdom, which influenced directly his successors, Father Pavel Florensky and Father Sergius Bulgakov. But as I point out very clearly in the book, my assessment is that even though these powerful thinkers who were much more patristically based than Solovyev was, well, Solovyev did not know the fathers. Florensky and Bulgakov did. So they developed some of his ideas, particularly sociology, tried to bring them within the tradition, but the general assessment is they didn't succeed. And the sort of broader Orthodox community has not accepted this particular stream of thought. So one has to see it in that kind of context. Now, I say as well that there are other aspects of Solovyev's thought, particularly his engagement with such modern areas and problems as legal philosophy and social and political philosophy and theology are much more to the mark, but they are almost ignored because of all the emphasis on the sociology. So there's a need for a redress of the balance there. In the chapter on social and political theology, I draw a lot on Solovyev. He was one of the first, certainly in the Orthodox context, to express a theological basis for the modern organization of society, which I think is rather important, to say the least.
Thank you so much.
Yaroslav Skira from Regis College. I'm just looking kind of for your impressions of ecumenical encounters of the Orthodox theologians. Certainly there are a number who are critical of the West, sometimes polemical, sometimes rightly so. But your impressions of the authors that you've gone through, their immense amount, were there kind of key events or ecumenical encounters that you would say would be normative or that would be important in the development of ideas within various authors or kind of broadly schools of thought? Given that much of that theology was written in exile for the Russians and the neopatristics.
Yes, but again, I would trace some of the fundamental thinking back to the Russian religious Renaissance. Most of the key thinkers of the period were very much imbued with a universalist view of Christianity. Not a sort of an institutional, my little church is the right church and everyone else is wrong kind of thing, but a much more universalist approach. And this goes back to Solovyev again. He was a universalist when it comes to ecclesiology. And I think that this approach, which one finds in the major his major successors, particularly Bulgakov, I think has filtered into at least the official Orthodox involvement in ecumenism. Perhaps not the universalist view of the church that one finds in these thinkers, but certainly the need for Orthodox to be deeply engaged in ecumenical dialogue. One of the aspects, and I treat a lot of this in detail in the chapter on ecclesiology and ecumenism, is that the two leading, what I consider to be the two leading Orthodox thinkers of the 20th century, Father Sergius Bulgakov and Father George Borowski, were both deeply committed and involved in ecumenism, but for very different reasons and from different perspectives. Bulgakov was very much in the Solovyev view of a universalist approach to Christianity. So for him, the unity of the church has never been lost. It is simply covered. And it's a question of discovering what that unity is and restating it. For Borowski, dogmatic issues are dominant. And until there is agreement on dogmatic issues, it is not possible to think about a sacramental unity, for example, in the church. This difference in views came out especially in what is called the intercommunion controversy with the Anglican Church in the 1930s, where those were the two views that were on the table. Both of them are well within the Orthodox tradition, and yet the outcome in terms of commitment to ecumenism, in a sense, is the same, but the perspective is quite different. Borowski's perspective is more, well, I don't think we can ever reach unity on dogmatic issues, but we'll keep witnessing to the fullness of Christianity that is found in the Orthodox Church. Bulgakov said, we can use the unity that exists as a basis for restoring intercommunion. So, by and large, though, Borowski's view is the dominant view in terms of Orthodox involvement in ecumenism. It's not Bulgakov's, it's Borowski's.
Thank you. Coming up on time, but might have time for one more question. Can I ask a question then?
Please, Chris.
You've been quite straightforward with your assessment of some of the limitations of it, and you've got some compelling explanations for them. But as you sit back and gaze upon your creation, is there something that you're particularly satisfied with or pleased with that give you a sense of satisfaction?
Well, I think it would have to do with having brought, as I said, in fact, a small library of books and writings over a period of a century and a half into some kind of understandable, coherent framework. That, I think, would be, if I say yes, I think I did that. Now we'll see what the real critics say as to whether I succeeded in doing that. It's not that there were no predecessors. There are lots of predecessors for this kind of approach, but I would say certainly not as comprehensive as what I've tried to do in this book, with gaps.
Okay. Well, certainly some fairly big name Protestant thinkers in the United States see it as a significant contribution. I'll be very interested to see how it's received by Orthodox readers and their assessment of it. Would you join me in thanking? Congratulations.